Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think we can go ahead and get started. It looks like we are at critical mass. So Congresswoman Dingell, can you start us off?
Yep. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We wanted to hold this briefing today because in Michigan, more than almost any other state in this country, we understand that the importance of PFAS and PFOA and how it is a forever chemical that is in too many places in our environment, and that it's in almost 98% of people's bodies. It has very toxic, harmful effects, and we have not been doing enough to eliminate it. So last Friday, a very significant announcement was made that the EPA posted a notice of proposed rulemaking saying that in September of 2022, they would publish a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. And upon publication, EPA will welcome comments on this proposed rulemaking for a 60-day comment period. And we are encouraging everybody to let people know how you feel and why this matters. In the winter of 2022 through 23, EPA anticipates issuing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking after the close of the comment period to seek public comment on designating other PFAS chemicals as CERCLA hazardous substances. And finally, EPA expects to issue a final rule for the designation of PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA in August 2023. We plan on holding EPA accountable into this important timeline. And in the meantime, I want to make it really clear that we are not going to stop putting pressure on the Senate to advance the PFAS Action Act, which has already passed the House twice with bipartisan support. This legislation would, in addition to designating PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances, establish a national drinking water standard for these chemicals, list them as hazardous substances under the Clean Air Act, require EPA to place discharge limits on industrial releases, prohibit unsafe incineration of PFAS waste, place a moratorium on the introduction of new PFAS into commerce, and more. And we also want to make sure that no one can take it back after it is put into rulemaking, and that's why we need to actually enshrine it into law. And now I'd like to turn this over to Melanie Benesh from the Environmental Working Group to give you a better understanding of what the EPA's decision means in practice. She has been an incredible fighter on this issue.
Oh, thank you so much, Congresswoman Dingell. I like to say that the only thing more persistent than PFAS is Debbie Dingell. And Friday's proposal really would not have come without her consistent leadership and advocacy for the PFAS Action Act, for the letter that she read with 127 other members of Congress calling on the White House to finalize this action and to actually propose this rule, and really her consistent calls for the EPA to address PFAS under the Superfund law. I'd also like to thank all of the other members of Congress who aren't a part of this precedent, but who also have championed this issue, who released statements on Friday, who co-sponsored and voted for the PFAS Action Act, and have also been loud advocates of addressing PFOA and PFAS under CERCLA. So I want to talk a little bit about what this designation would do. This is really one of the most important steps that the EPA can take to address existing PFAS contamination. And is needed, this designation is needed to give the EPA better tools to clean up the many contaminated sites in Michigan and across the country. So here's how it will help EPA. There will be new reporting requirements that make it easy for the EPA, or much easier for the EPA, to quickly respond to new releases of PFOA and PFAS. It's also going to make it easier for the EPA to prioritize sites that are contaminated with PFOA and PFAS, because it'll influence the ranking system that the EPA uses to decide which sites become national priority list sites under the Superfund law. It will allow the EPA to use appropriated funds in the Superfund to jumpstart cleanup, to initiate cleanup when a polluter hasn't been identified, or to quickly respond in emergency situations when there's a desperate need for alternative sources of drinking water, for example. And it will also allow the EPA to recover that money when a polluter is identified, so that it is really the polluter who is paying and not the American taxpayer. This will also, in situations where a polluter has been identified but is really refusing to cooperate, the EPA will have much stronger enforcement power. They will be able to compel a cleanup and impose daily fines if needed to make sure that that polluter actually takes action. And then also this designation will really help the EPA hold the Department of Defense, which is responsible for a lot of contamination from PFOA and PFAS through the use of firefighting foam, will help hold the DoD more accountable. I also want to briefly talk about what this won't do, because there has been a lot of misinformation. This is not a ban on PFAS. This is a regulatory action affecting cleanup, but it is not a ban on any existing uses. And because PFOA and PFAS have already been largely phased out of commerce, it is going to create minimal new obligations on PFAS manufacturing. It is not going to immediately create new Superfund national priority sites. That there's an established process that takes time. It's not going to create new liability for farmers. There is, because of the way that the law works, it is not going to immediately reopen closed Superfund sites. Again, there is a process for that. It's not going to create unprecedented or unfair liability for innocent parties. Circle already has mechanisms to deal with that. And it isn't going to fundamentally change the Superfund process that the EPA has been using for the last 40 years in any meaningful way. And so just to close, I want to say EWG really applauds this action by the EPA. We look forward to working with Representative Dingell and other champions on this issue. We look forward to continuing to put the pressure on EPA to quickly finalize this action and take other meaningful, important actions addressing industrial discharges, drinking water standards, and eliminating non-essential everyday uses of PFAS. So thank you again for your time and for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Melanie. Also with us today is somebody that is a dear friend, but that I have worked with on so many issues. She is a tireless champion for Michigan's environment and the Great Lakes. She has worked hand in hand with me as we have confronted the PFAS crisis across the state. Lisa Wozniak is the head of the Michigan League of Conservation Voters in Michigan. And let me introduce her now for her words of wisdom on this EPA decision and the impact on Michigan.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Yes, my name is Lisa Wozniak. I'm the executive director of the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, and we work every single day here in this beautiful state to protect our air, land, and water in communities all across Michigan. And we do that by activating voters and to elect and hold accountable people who really fight for an environment that sustains the health and well-being of us all. And no one is better epitomizes that than Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. She is has been a champion, and I will touch on that in my comments today. Addressing PFAS contamination is just one of the many things that she has been tackling. These chemicals have been found in the water in communities all across our state. And it's so hard for me to say that because we now have about 170 active known PFAS sites in Michigan. And so this has become a core focus of our organization over the last many years. The EPA's proposed declaration of PFOS and PFOA as hazardous substances is a significant step forward in both holding polluters accountable for contaminating our water and protecting public health. I want to thank our Congresswoman for her relentless advocacy and her leadership on this issue. It has just been, continuous, determined, and very, very focused. The name Dingell is associated with a long legacy, I'm sure we all know, of advocacy in the protection of human health and our natural resources. The late Congressman John Dingell was a giant in terms of environmental protection and a lead author in the National Environmental Protection Act, the Magna Carta of American environmental law, which sparked the creation of the EPA and strengthened the federal government's role in the protection of our air, our land, and our water. And Congresswoman Dingell is not only carrying on this legacy, she continues to push for higher ground when it comes to protecting community health, protecting our drinking water. And she knows that here in Michigan, water is a critical part of who we are. I'm not saying that it's not true all across this country, but in Michigan, it literally defines our state economically, geographically, culturally. It's in our DNA. And it has become because of Congresswoman Dingell's work and others in the delegation, which has been noted, that water, that the EPA is finally beginning to treat these toxic chemicals with the urgency that they deserve. I want to thank you, Congresswoman Dingell, for your leadership and your commitment to protecting the health of the American people. By declaring these toxic chemicals as hazardous substances, they will be considered for Superfund delegation, which has been designation, which has been pointed out. It would allow the EPA oversight authority that is critical to make sure that polluters are paying to clean up their mess. And once finalized, we expect that this declaration will have real implications and impacts here in this beautiful state of Michigan, again, where we have over 170 active sites, known sites, and many, many more waiting in the wings. So one example of that I will point out is the Wolverine Worldwide shoe tannery site in West Michigan, which contaminated the Rockford and Belmont drinking water right outside our state's second largest city, which is Grand Rapids. And we have a long way to go in addressing these toxic forever chemicals. This declaration is critical to make official, and I want to thank the leadership of you, Congresswoman Dingell, in making this possible to have this conversation today and continue to push forward with all of what you're doing on PFAS. So thank you for allowing me to join this important conversation.
Thank you, Lisa. Now we're going to hear from Lamisha Whittington, who is the Deputy Director of Advanced Carolina, who's going to highlight what the impacts are of PFAS, and other of these chemicals on frontline communities.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Dingell. As was stated, my name is Lamisha Whittington, and I am honored to serve as the Deputy Political Director of Advanced Carolina and as an appointed member of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board. And we stand in allyship with Michigan and just deeply appreciate, thank you, Congresswoman Dingell, for your leadership on PFAS. Communities in North Carolina, thank you. And people suffering from the harms of PFAS across the country, thank you. The EPA's proposal last week to designate PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances is the federal government's first concrete step toward holding polluters accountable for past contamination to these chemicals after decades of reckless disregard for the health and safety of our communities. I know from hearing, again, the prolific speakers aside of me today, that the citizens of Michigan appreciate your leadership on PFAS, and they're not alone. In North Carolina, we have the unfortunate distinction of ranking as the third state with the highest PFAS exposure in the United States, with over 1.5 million North Carolina residents impacted directly through our water, coupled with exposure to PFAS contaminated fast food containers that we know those restaurants are located in food insecure counties, especially rural counties in North Carolina, and we are 80% rural. Our hot spots, if folks have seen in the news, have included Brunswick County, New Hanover County, Cumberland, Bladen, Columbus, and parts of Wake. So many communities are hurting, especially our frontline communities. And it is by the way of the Cape Fear River when a corporation dumped gallons of PFAS into our Cape Fear River, our largest watershed that provides so much vital life source of water to so many wells and through municipal water. Nationwide, PFAS chemicals pose risk to thousands of communities, and the heightened risk is especially concerning for disadvantaged communities and communities of color who often already confront cumulative and disproportionate impact risk from toxins and also face insurmountable cost for cleanup. We know the battle against PFAS contamination is just the beginning, but the EPA's action gives us hope. Congresswoman Dingell, you give us hope. We appreciate Administrator Michael Regan's leadership and his decision to visit North Carolina last October to announce EPA's PFAS strategic roadmap. The Biden administration has, with EPA's proposal, begun to make good on its pledge to help environmental justice communities threatened by PFAS. Congresswoman Dingell, you've been strong and steady in your efforts to combat PFAS and to hold polluters accountable. We strongly support your efforts to pass the PFAS Action Act, the Keep Food Containers Safe from PFAS Act, No PFAS in Cosmetics Act, Act and Protecting Firefighters from Adverse Substances PFAS Act. And as a native Afro-Indigenous North Carolinian, I had a great uncle who retired from DuPont, the very corporation that is responsible for dumping the PFAS in our rivers. So I thank you for holding this as a personal declaration of standing against PFAS. We appreciate your strong leadership and enthusiastically support your ongoing efforts to protect our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, but I thank you all for your comments, but we're a team and we have all worked very hard together to get us where we are today. And perhaps one of the people that's worked on it the longest is the person I'm about to introduce. Rob Bilott has taught me, he has taught all of us. He learned early about the devastating consequences and the hazards of PFAS and PFOA and has led this fight for a long time. He's a distinguished environmental lawyer and advocate who's been working on PFAS issues for many years. And Rob, could you tell us what more we've got to do to continue to move forward building on the EPA's circular announcement last Friday?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Dingell. You know, it's just really an honor to be part of this group, and I really appreciate everything you've been doing, but all the folks on this call and across the country who have been working to raise this issue, not only nationwide, but worldwide, about what is really one of the biggest public and environmental health threats in the history here of our country. You know, and it was fantastic to see our Federal Environmental Protection Agency finally acknowledge the overwhelming evidence of the nature and severity of the threat posed by at least two of these chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, and proposed to designate those as hazardous. You know, this follows on the heels of a National Academy of Sciences report that just recently came out, really acknowledging and confirming the scope and severity of the public health threat to the entire country. You know, these are chemicals that are coursing through the veins of virtually everyone in this country and worldwide. And what we saw in that National Academy's report was it's a serious health threat right now. And, you know, a recent report that even linked millions of deaths since 1999. So it's tremendous to see the EPA finally taking this step. But frankly, it's taken us way too long to get here. You know, decades, unfortunately, of corporate cover-up and concealment of the facts and the information that, you know, really put our agencies and our public health officials and legislators at a disadvantage to try to understand what was really known about these chemicals. Finally, that information has made its way out, and we're seeing these steps being taken. But, you know, unfortunately, this process continues to move. You know, this is a proposal, and we hope to see it finalized here in the next year or so. In the meantime, we've got companies that have made this and pumped it out into our world, into our environment for decades, knowing this was going to happen, that continue to this day to deny and unfortunately, you know, challenge any responsibility, even taking as governmental agencies, including states, to court to try to stop implementation of laws and rules like this. So it's really important that we be able to use this tool under the CERCLA statute to enable people to try to finally start to hold these companies responsible. You know, we know where these chemicals came from. We know who made them, and we know who put them out there into this environment. We know the names of those companies, and it's been taking an incredible long time to really hold them responsible and to make sure that the public, the people whose drinking water is contaminated, communities that are now having to filter this out of their water, that they're not the ones stuck having to pay those costs, that we use this tool and other tools to make sure that the people we know are responsible are held responsible and actually start to pay those costs, and that people don't have to keep going into court for decades fighting this into courtrooms. This is an incredible first step toward giving people the tools to hold these people responsible. And you heard about some other laws that have been in the works for a while too, to try to further implement that. One of them in particular that's out there, the PFAS Accountability Act, you know, would go to tremendous steps to help make sure that the people who cause this problem are the ones who are held responsible. So I think it's an incredible progress. And, I look forward to working with everyone here and others across the country and internationally to make sure we continue on this and we continue to do what we can to address this public health threat and to make sure that people who caused this are the ones that are held responsible, not all of us. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Dingell, and all the others on the panel today for everything you're doing to make sure that this is addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Now, Michaela, we're going to open this up to the press and you're going to moderate that.
Yep, so please use the raise hand function if you would like to ask your question live. Otherwise, type your question in the Q&A box and we will read it. So we'll go ahead and start with Chantal Riley, who has a question for Melanie. It is, can you talk about the specifics of how the designation will help the EPA hold the Department of Defense accountable?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And Rob, who is a longtime CERCLA litigator, please feel free to jump in if I've missed anything. So I think one way is just the prioritization of sites that are contaminated with PFOA and PFAS. The DoD has been trying to address these chemicals really under discretionary authority. But Section 120 of CERCLA, which applies to federal facilities, doesn't talk about pollutants and contaminants, which is the word that the EPA usually use for, and the word that CERCLA uses for things that are not designated as hazardous substances, where there's a little bit more discretionary authority or where you have to show that something poses more of an imminent and substantial threat. So those words are in Section 120. What Section 120 talks about hazardous substances. And so in terms of actually prioritizing the cleanup of these chemicals at DOD sites, it gives the EPA a lot more leverage to work those into their agreements, to prioritize those in those agreements. And then even within DOD's own ranking system for contaminated sites, it helps to elevate those. More specifically, Section 120H of CERCLA talks about property being transferred by federal agencies. And so if the Department of Defense has a formally used base that they are trying to get rid of, or sell or convert into private public land, then that there are a lot of requirements related to hazardous substances. And so there are a lot of disclosures. I believe the hazardous substances have to be cleaned up under that provision. There are certain assurances and notifications that the DoD would have to make to the state related to the presence and how they've addressed the hazardous substances. And so particularly if it is a formerly used defense site or a land where the government is trying to transfer the lease, then that creates a lot of new obligations for DoD related specifically to those hazardous substances, which would include PFOA and PFAS. Rob, I don't know if you have anything to add about how this helps hold the DoD accountable.
Well, yeah, I think just kind of on a simplistic basis, one of the things I've heard over the years is DoD saying, we're not allowed to go in and spend money to clean up some of these sites because it's not a hazardous waste site. It's not a site where there are hazardous substances released. And this addresses that most basic issue that allows those funds to actually be used at some of these sites of concern. So that's the only thing I would add.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Melissa with the Detroit News. Melissa, you should be on now.
Hi, thank you all for doing this call. Hopefully you can hear me. I had, sorry if I missed this, but I hoped maybe you guys could just talk a little bit about what you expect the timeline to look like. I understand the rule or the proposal will be published in September, I think you said, but when realistically could we see this actually come into effect? And then beyond that, do you anticipate litigation could slow that down?
Well, we anticipate, and I've been told by EPA, the final rule would be out by next August, following all of the rulemaking procedures. I'll let Rob talk about what he expects, and we plan on holding EPA accountable to that timeline. Since I got to Congress, which, hasn't been as long as some, but I have been promised there would be a drinking water standard, and we still do not have a drinking water standard for PFAS. And the state of Michigan we have a guideline, and the state of Michigan under Rick Snyder Governor Snyder, Republican governor, set a scientific advisory committee who set a more stringent drinking water standard for Michigan than the guideline is at the EPA level. So it is time for this all to get done, and we will hold them accountable. Rob, you want to answer the question on?
Yeah, you know, I think that's one of the frustrating things about this process. And keep in mind, this has been a process that's been in play now for several decades. And I think that's one of the concerns about watching the way this plays out at the regulatory level. There are so many hoops and procedures to walk through, including, you know, what we've just seen here is the proposal for the rule, and then that'll be published, and then there's public comment, and then there's a final rule, and then there could be challenges, and that's why you see a lot of legislation being proposed to try to cut through that and simply say, we are, as a matter of law, going to declare these hazardous under the Superfund law, or we are, as a matter of law, saying here's the drinking water standards for these chemicals, because the regulatory process has all of these different procedures and timelines and schedules that unfortunately allow a lot of things to drag on for quite some time. And I think from what I understand, the EPA is really hoping to expedite this and to push through this in a pretty rapid fashion, hopefully within the next year, to have the final rule out. But again, the concern is, as we've seen already in some states, you know, states that have tried to adopt, for example, enforceable drinking water standards, have had their standards challenged in court by some of these companies trying to prevent it and trying to delay that. And so again, you know, there's a real concern that we're dealing with a public health issue, a public health threat, an environmental health threat, and we need to move forward quickly and to address this quickly for the benefit of the public. And, you know, we should be doing what we can to try to prevent these delay tactics from continuing to occur. So hopefully with the amount of attention and awareness of how important this is, that this move forward rapidly, that we'll see it move forward rapidly.
And that's why we are not taking the pressure off for Senate action on the PFAS Action Act. I'm gonna call Tom Carper next week when we get back and still try to get it done. So it's, you know, rulemaking is great. It is something that this administration can get done, but to put it into law requires the Congress to act.
So we're going to try to get to a few more questions here. If any of our panelists have to leave at 2, that's okay, but we will get to a few more questions. Next, we're going to go to Matthew Shanbaum with Michigan Daily, who asks, following this classification, what hopes do you have for your other PFAS acts besides the PFAS Action Act? Congresswoman Dingell.
Well, we're going to keep pushing on all of them. I think too many people do not understand that they are encountering this chemical every single day from, you know, look, I used to burn my eggs. I had Teflon pans, but I threw all my Teflon pans out when I found out the PFAS was in them. They're in our socks, they're in food storage containers, they're in our makeup, and the makeup isn't labeled. So all of us here have been trying to educate consumers about where it is and I think the more the public becomes aware, the more public is going to demand action. This is certainly a first step, and I think that as people study it, it'll increase the pressure for Congress to act on all of these pieces of legislation.
Next, we're going to go to Paula Gardner with Bridge, Michigan. Paula, you can ask your question.
Hello, thank you. Melanie mentioned that this would create minimal new obligations. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what will be different for private industry who were PFAS users, not manufacturers, and also just get a gauge on the rate of success of getting cleanup costs from these companies thus far.
Sure, I'm happy to share a little bit about that. So this proposed designation, it's limited to 2 of the best studied PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. They are chemicals that I think are pretty widely accepted to be very toxic, which is why the EPA was able to negotiate industry phase outs now 15 years ago. And so these have largely been phased out of commerce as of 2015 or so. And so for a user of products that contain PFAS. It is unlikely that those users are using the two PFAS that are subject to this proposal, PFOA and PFAS. They should probably make sure that they're not using those two. But then your only obligation, so there is what's called a reportable quantity as part of this rule. If you are releasing more than 1 pound over a 24-hour period, you are required to notify the National Response Center, which will notify the EPA. That will trigger an investigation. That doesn't automatically make you liable, but if you are releasing those two compounds, you need to report it. But again, because these have largely been phased out of commerce, the EPA doesn't estimate that there's a lot of companies that are going to be releasing those amounts. And then your only other real obligation as a manufacturer or a user of these chemicals is to use them responsibly and not release them into the environment. So there are roughly 800 hazardous substances. Lots of them are used by industries all the time. That's why this really isn't a ban. The liability only comes into play once you've released those chemicals into the environment in a way that puts human health or the environment at risk. And so if you are a company, you will need to report, and you will need to, if you are using these chemicals, use them in a way so that you're not releasing them into the environment and putting your neighbors at risk.
Well, I may use this as an opportunity to make a point again about Michigan, and I'd love Lisa to comment about this. Michigan does not have strong polluter pay laws or hold companies accountable enough. Tri-Bar did a PFAS release 4 years ago into the Huron River, and I don't know how long it'll be before people will be able to eat the fish again in the water. We have a do not eat fish, and I have some of my residents are always, when am I going to be able to eat the fish again? And they're really serious consequences. And you know, we continue to see polluters having inexcusable releases, and we've got to find a way that we are holding polluters more accountable on some of the spills that we are seeing. I can't quite frankly believe the number I've seen even in the last year of other. Tri-Bar did PFAS 4 years ago. I think it was 4 years ago, right, Lisa? So,
Do you want me to add?
yes,
in,
I would love it.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. Another reason that this is so important, the federal action, is indeed because we do not have strong polluter pay laws in the state of Michigan. We once did. Going back to the 80s, we had the strongest polluter pay laws in the nation that were dismantled under the Engler administration. So holding polluters accountable is of utmost importance for PFAS and a host of other toxic chemicals that are being released into our environment and poisoning our fish and poisoning, frankly, in the Oscoda area, which is a highly contaminated Air Force site in the state of Michigan. There are warnings not only for the fish, but for deer consumption. That the entire area is contaminated with PFAS. So the polluter pay piece of this is critical. And while we are working very hard here at the state level to ensure that we reinstate laws at the state level, it is critical that action is taken at the federal level. So again, just underlying the importance of this action on the part of the EPA.
Next, we have a question from John McCracken at chris.org. It is, what solutions have you seen residents in PFAS affected communities working on specifically related to drinking water while they wait for EPA designations to be finalized?
I can actually speak to that here in North Carolina. And what I do want to say is absolutely +1 to North Carolina. Our regulations with actually holding corporations accountable is almost 0 to none. And so we are seriously following the lead of Michigan and just really needing that federal oversight and support to actually implement the regulatory language and provisions that we need here in North Carolina. So when the news of PFAS and the actual spill in the Cape Fear River came to light, that was due to investigative journalism. It wasn't due to any government institutions elevating and releasing that information, even though the emissions of PFAS and point source pollution was occurring for 40 years. We didn't find it out until 2018 when we were dealing with Hurricane Florence and the exacerbation of those flood-torn waters, actually spreading that PFAS contaminated water even further. So what we've had to do as citizens, even though, again, I may serve as deputy director, but I'm in North Carolina, have been and Afro-Indigenous woman. And as a citizen, we've had to do mutual aid. One, I served as a community liaison to the National Academy of Sciences, as Rob already mentioned, that study. We as citizens had to actually sign up to become community liaisons and agree to help the research around the CDC clinical testing guidelines that has been published. Very fortunate to be published in that report, but that was the citizens who actually had to come out to those town halls on our own dime, on our own, again, penny. In addition to that, we as citizens, we had to join together as co-petitioner alongside other organizations with Center for Environmental Health, had to file a petition to the EPA in 2020. It was denied. That petition was standing against Comores and asking them to actually hold the polluter accountable, and that they needed to pay, not us, for the actual public health studies data. That's what we've had to do as community members, is not only give each other water, do fundraisers to give bottled water to one another because we can't afford reverse osmosis machines. We're having to do actual on the ground work, and we're now engaging with ARPA funding and the infrastructure funding to help us apply for money, historic funding that's coming to North Carolina due to COVID-19. We're now actually having to use that money to remediate our water infrastructure while we're still waiting for the corporations to be held accountable for doing the damage. We are having to be very creative and look. And recently I was informed that due to our efforts in educating community around that ARPA funding, one community of 300 people received $13 million, the largest amount they've ever received to remediate their water and infrastructure pipe. But that was due to ARPA funding for water remediation, not due to actually holding corporate polluters responsible and accountable. And so that's some of the issues and on the ground strategies that we've had to do. We've had to operate in advocacy, governance, and policy. And that's why we have championed what Congresswoman Dingell has led as initiatives, is because even we have a Black firefighters cohort where they were not even aware of the PFAS contamination because community meetings were not actually being held by the corporation itself. And we had to hold that education. And then we were able to connect with firefighters in Canada, firefighters in Australia, and it's become a global scale issue that we have all become aware of, that has bound us together in community resiliency. And of course, because of Congresswoman Dingell, because of this decision, this proposal by the EPA, we finally have a roadmap to hold accountable what our communities have had to overcome in resiliency and creating those survival modes ourselves. So again, thank you. That's some of what we've had to do.
You know, I will jump in just real briefly too. I mean, up to now, really what communities have been forced to do is to go into courts and to try to hold folks responsible for this, and to try to get clean water, to try to get medical testing, to try to get compensated for the diseases that have been caused. And up to now, what it's been is a huge fight in the courts where the companies have been denying this stuff isn't harmful. You can't prove that it's actually causing any harm, which is why having the US EPA designate and declare this hazardous and to release the kind of information we're seeing releasing, confirming these health effects, is incredibly helpful to those efforts. But we still have a system where the burden is placed upon the exposed people to have to prove that these things are causing these harms, which again is why CERCLA is so important, because it avoids that. But also things like the PFAS Accountability Act that would say, the burden should be on the folks that created these to prove that they're not causing this harm. Because right now, people have been, and to this day, still forced into courtrooms to fight about this and to fight over whether these are harmful, whether they're hazardous. And so we've got to do what we can to stop that and to be able to get people to the point where this is a resolved issue. These are hazardous, these are dangerous, and we're going to give people the tools to protect themselves and their communities.
May I add just a little bit here, just from a Michigan-based perspective? And Lamisha, I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, we have very similar situation here in Michigan, but if not for the voices of the citizens of the state, the voters of the state who have raised their voices loudly, and in fact have come together to create a new network called the Great Lakes PFAS Action Network. And if not for the media that then took hold of this and actually ran with it, and if not for amazing leaders like Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, these issues would remain very, very quiet, community by community, suffering from the burden of these poisons. And I will tell you, having watched poll after poll after poll after poll for the last 48 plus months, one of the top 3 issues in the state of Michigan that people are most concerned about, yes, it's economy, yes, it's healthcare, it is safe, clean drinking water. And it is largely in part because of the growing number of PFAS contaminated sites in this beautiful state. So I can't stress enough the importance of Congresswoman Debbie Dingell's leadership and the importance of this action on the part of the EPA.
I think we have time for just a couple more, so we'll go to Ryan Van Belzer from Louisville Public Media, who asks, what responsibility does government have to warn people their water is contaminated with PFAS, and whose responsibility is it? Federal, state, local, or all three?
Well, I think all of us would answer that question and say all three. We're trying to get these standards set. We've been trying to do it. So you see advocacy groups, you see attorneys, all of us are very dedicated to raising consumer awareness of the danger and trying to get more people to demand action as we try to get federal laws, state laws, and local laws. It really needs to be at the water is tested frequently at the local level, but it really needs to be at the federal and state level that we are setting these strong standards so we keep our citizens safe.
Yeah, I would just add that there's a public health responsibility to warn people that their water is contaminated. But there are not yet federal drinking water standards, and they're not yet, because there are no federal standards, there are no federal testing requirements. Every water system is going to be tested over the next 2 years because of a special rule that requires testing for PFAS. But it's really only the states that have set low drinking water limits for PFAS, where those drinking water systems are required to regularly test and let people know if their water is above the state limits. Otherwise, it's really it's more of a public health responsibility than it is a legal responsibility until the EPA proposes that drinking water limit, which we anticipate they will do by the end of this year.
Okay, this will be the last question. We have Michael Booth from the Colorado Sun asks, can you talk about potential exposure of liability to local drinking water agencies and local wastewater biosolids agencies, and whether Congress has or will appropriate money to help them build new facilities or otherwise cover these new hazardous waste liabilities?
Melanie, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I will say Congress has already appropriated quite a bit of money to help utilities upgrade their infrastructure under the bipartisan infrastructure deal to address their infrastructure to better filter and get ahead of this issue. I do think this issue has been a little bit of a red herring, just as there are a few parties that I think are going to be immediately liable under a CERCLA designation. I think water utilities are likely going to be very low on the list of polluters that EPA is going to be looking for. The EPA has discretion as to who they bring into litigation. And then there are a number of defenses and liability limits that apply to municipalities that are already worked into CERCLA. And if wastewater utilities have permits for the discharge of PFOA and PFAS, once something's written into a permit, then that becomes a federally permitted release, which is also a defense under CERCLA. And so really one of the best things that they can be doing is actually asking their state regulators to write this into their permits. And so they're already addressing this ahead of time. And certainly utilities can also use their pretreatment authority to work with their upstream polluters so that they are sending less pollution to those wastewater utilities. And so I think there are a lot of solutions. That said, this is a proposed rule, and this is one of the things that the EPA, I think, is seeking some comment and direction on. The EPA can issue a policy guidance that explains how they plan to use their enforcement discretion to really make sure that those who are most responsible for this pollution really pay the lion's share of the liability. And that's how CERCLA has largely worked for the last 40 years. And so I know that water utilities are really concerned about this, but I do think that concern is overstated. And then the only other thing I will say about the biosolids issue is biosolids are already contaminated with a lot of hazardous substances, and that has not created any sort of significant new liability. There are not any agricultural sites on the national priorities list that are there because of farming activities. They are all farms that became dumping sites or were near manufacturing facilities. And so I don't think we're going to see a lot of farms or utilities become Superfund sites overnight. Rob, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, other than, at full disclosure, we're representing water utilities all across the US that are right now trying to make sure that any of these costs, of additional treatment or installation of treatment system or anything, again, that we make sure that they are borne by the right parties here. And again, the way in which this is implemented, the agency will have discretion. The agency understands, and hopefully will understand, again, we know who created these toxins. We know who put them out there. And we know, a utility that's simply trying to clean them out of the water is very different than the folks who pumped them out knowing, hey, this is going to get into everybody's water. So you've got water utilities all across the US right now that are looking for tools, frankly, to make sure that the people who caused the contamination are really the ones held responsible here. And hopefully this will be an additional tool that they can use to help make sure that the proper parties are held responsible.
So those are all the questions that we have time for today. Congresswoman, do you have anything to close on?
No, thank you for everybody participating. I have 1,000 more thoughts about how much more work we need to be doing. Even as I'm looking at Lisa and thinking about 5 more issues in Michigan, just even as states are giving permits to people and allowing releases. So we have to keep working to get laws passed and to get this into holding polluters accountable, making polluters pay, and protecting our environment. There are far more chemicals in our environment than people realize. And I feel sometimes we're going backwards, not going forwards. So thank you, everybody. We're going to keep up the fight.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.